welcome everybody to this panel. I'm really excited to be here with Mark Blyth, Richard Wolff, and Ben Burgis. Just a little bit of bios on all of our guests today. We have Professor Mark Blyth, who, let me see if I get this right, is the William R. Rhodes Professor of International Economics at the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs at Brown University. He's also the author of Austerity, The History of a Dangerous Idea, and most recently, Angronomics. Thank you so much, Mark, for being here.
Thank you.
We're also joined by our friend and teacher, Richard Wolff, Professor Emeritus of Economics at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, currently visiting professor in the graduate program at the New School in New York. You also probably know him from Economic Update, and his most recent book is The Sickness is the System. Thanks for being here, Richard.
Oh, thank you. Glad to do it.
And last but not least is our friend Ben Burgis, author of Give Them an Argument, host of another show called Give Them an Argument, Jackman columnist, professor of logic, and author of the upcoming book, Canceling Comedians While the World Burns.
All right. Thank you so much, David.
Well, yeah, I'm really happy to be here. And for folks who don't know me, my name is David Griscom. I've been one of Michael's collaborators for the past few years here at the Michael Brooks Show. I'm also the host of a new show called Left Reckoning with Matt Leck. And, this is going to be a really exciting panel. We're going to be able to jump into a lot of high-level ideas tonight. But just to start, we wanted to take a little bit of time to remember our friend Michael. And, if any of y'all had any memories or reflections that you'd like to share, I'll start with you, Ben.
Yeah. I guess, I was lucky enough to be able to know Michael pretty well and to work with him in a lot of things, during the last couple of years of his life. I met him in 2018 at a conference, and he told me, we were out at the bar with our mutual editor, Doug Lane. The first day of the conference, anybody who knew Michael in real life would know that he's not a big drinker, but he had a couple of drinks, and we were vibing, and he kind of said over the course of the conversation, and it ended up being mostly me and Michael talking. That, gotta have you on the show sometime, brother. And I thought, oh, great. I've listened to this, a lot of fun, and, I'll probably be on a couple times and, promote the book. And then the idea of doing those, those weekly debunk segments, where, for example, I first met Professor Wolff, that was entirely Michael's idea. I'd had no kind of, I had no inkling of that at all. And he was just very, something I've thought about a lot, the months since Michael passed is, the way that he used the sort of platforms he'd built up, the influence he had to relentlessly, promote the work of people he thought had something interesting to say. And, obviously I think I was one of the biggest beneficiaries of that, but, he was also just, he was also tremendously, tremendously funny person, as anybody who ever, listened to any of his shows, knows. I remember like one of the last times I crashed at, his apartment, I just coming in and, just playing him a clip of a little, comedy sketch about Bernie Sanders that I knew that he would like, and just watching him laugh as if it was the funniest thing that anybody had ever shown him in his entire life, which I can't, take any credit for, both because I didn't make the clip, but also because he laughed like that all the time, and he was just, and he was also tremendously serious about, about his work and the contribution they thought he could make. And he was very insightful. And I remember, I guess I'll just close with this, because it's relevant to the topic of today's panel, that while, I was still living in New Jersey and I was often over at his apartment in Brooklyn, helping him work on his wonderful book Against the Web. reading over drafts and things. And there's a line in there that I think shows both Michael's insight and his humor that I always think about, where he talks about, it's in a chapter to which he spends a lot of time making fun of Jordan Peterson, and then he starts talking about the possibility of a less hierarchical economic system, and he talks about the Mondragon Corporation in Spain, and says that it's living proof that it is in fact possible to end structures of domination in the workplace without the dragon of chaos, ravaging the countryside. And anyway, that's always made me laugh. So thought I'd close with that.
That's so perfect. I know, and like one thing that I'm so grateful for have been able to spend time with Michael is how great he was at bringing people together, from all over, different walks of life, different, perspectives and career paths and things like that. I have to, mention, since we have Richard Wolff on the, on the panel today, I remember when y'all met for the first time was at a Jordan Peterson conference, and I won't spoil the story, but it was very funny because I remember getting text messages all night long. For a long time on the show on TMBS, I've been doing an economic segment, and Michael was always joking that I was coming for Richard Wolff's crown, and everyone got a big kick out of that. But I guess when he met Richard Wolff for the first time at, I believe, a Jordan Peterson conference,
Boise.
He was texting me. He's like, he told Richard about it, and that, Richard not only was a really smart guy, but a funny guy, which, if you know anything about Michael, means that he really, really likes you. And I'm so grateful that you're here too with us today, Richard. I don't know if there's anything that you wanted to share in Michael's memory.
Yeah, a couple of things. That's right. I think it is the first time I met him was at the Jordan Peterson conference. And the whole thing was funny. And he enjoyed it, and I enjoyed it for the humor. So let me tell you briefly about it, because it's a way of my linking to him and you to both of us. The conference took place at Boise State University in Boise, Montana, a place I had never heard of, basically, other than vaguely in a geography lesson. Nice place to go. And I had been called up and told by the local organizers, students and faculty, that they had decided to have a conference on the work of Jordan Peterson, but that since Jordan Peterson had apparently repeatedly said how no, quote, I quote, is what they told me, no Marxist would dare to debate me, he said. And so they knew who they were talking to, so they told me that. So I said, okay, you got me, I'll do it, because I'm not going to let that go, if I don't have to. So I agreed I would debate him. A week or two later, they called me back. This was quite a while before the conference. They call me back and they tell me the following. They informed Jordan Peterson that he would be the subject of their conference, and that part of it would be a debate over the relevance of Marxism between him and me. I had, meantime, I hate to admit this, but it's the truth. When they first called me and said there'd be a conference about Jordan Peterson, my response was, who? Because I had no idea who he was. Had not crossed my radar. So I did my, the usual Google search, and I quickly discovered him, and I saw the comments on Marxism. And then I realized this debate would be kind of easy, because clearly he really, all due respect, he didn't know anything about it. He dismissed it and had, conventional tropes of dismissal that he had inherited, and he repeated those. But you could tell in 2 seconds that he wasn't very familiar with this, obviously hadn't spent much time learning it. So this would be easy. They called me up and told me that Jordan Peterson had withdrawn, would not come to the conference, and would not debate me, but didn't say that. This is them. Instead, he raised his fee from what they told me, from $5,000 to $50,000. This made me upset on 2 grounds. One, I wasn't getting anywhere near the lower number, let alone the higher one. And obviously, anything called Boise State could not come up with that kind of money I mean, this is nutty, right? This is crap. So he was out. And they said to me, we would like you to come anyway, and we will put on the platform 2 chairs. One you will occupy, and one will sit there empty, which is what they did. And so, you know, when you have a debate like that, it's obviously not a debate. And so I had good time. I made fun of the fellow as best I could. I tried to be reasonably polite, although with a guy like that, that's not so easy. But in any case, I tried. And one of the people who enjoyed the humor, and I began noticing him because every time I tried to do something I thought was funny, he laughed. You know, that's what a comedic hope is, right? You find out one person and then you address him or her with what your hope's on. And he came up and we got to know each other, and I've been on the program ever since, fairly often. And the other 2 things, very quickly, he and I would meet in a coffee shop right off the Union Square in Manhattan. He would meet me there, same one. He loved it. He liked to play. Very nice, very pleasant one. And every time I met him, he didn't have it written down, but he had a head full of plans, full of collaborations. It was amazing. I mean, the guy, you had the feeling he lived it and he slept it, and it was forever in his brain, figuring out how we on the left, being few, could get together, help each other, and build this thing. And I appreciate that. I love that kind of mentality. His was very fertile. It was pleasure working with him because he had literally a bunch of new plans and ideas all the time, every time I met him. And the last thing is, you know, coming out of the Marxian tradition, which is where I come from and which I'm proud to be part of, you're supposed to be, and I've tried to be, internationalist, to view yourself as a citizen of the world. And I try. But I know that my work has been lax in that regard, that my stuff tends more to be U.S. focused and not very well internet. And he was excellent on that. He would give me suggestions. He would give me advice. His programs, those that I have ever seen, were very careful to include international things. I thought that was very effective and very creative. And I looked to him to give me advice, which he did, how to make my programs a bit more like that, because I think I was deficient and he had done that better. So those are the things I remember beyond what all of you have said, that he was fun to be with and had a great sense of humor.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly right. And I know he'd really appreciate that. And I have to also say, as somebody who is a regular recipient of texts at 2 a.m, it is true that his brain was always on and he was always gaming things out. And, you know, and Mark, you know, I just would like to let you know that we were always such big fans of your work, and having you on TMBS was such a joy, not only for your wealth of analysis, but also for your humor, which again is a very big part of the Michael Brooks, project. And we always enjoyed when you came on TMBS. But I was wondering if you had anything that you'd like to say too before we kick off this conversation.
Sure. Our relationship was much more attenuated. I mean, we never met face to face. It was this. This is how we met. And also, what was great about it was we had no preamble. Right? There was no, but it was like you were on, let's do this thing. And I think what I discovered, why I kept coming back, right? Because, you know, there are only so many hours in the day you want to do this stuff, is one, he was a very decent human being. Just somebody who's, you know, he's doing this because he's got the welfare of others written into his soul, right? And there's just not that many people who are like that. The second thing is he's bloody smart, but he also understands that you can be smart, but you can be smart in a narrow academic sense, whereby your ability to communicate and affect the world through your smartness declines as a function of your intelligence. And he rebelled against that, right? He was somebody who wanted to explain, and he liked explaining. But his third thing, and this is where we really bonded, was that we both puzzled over the continuing inability of particularly the Democratic Party in the United States to provide the platform for a broad-based left-of-centre working person's movement that would affect lasting progressive change. And we both came to the following conclusion, that unfortunately it's a feature, not a bug. This really is built into the design of the system. And once you realize that and start there, the conversations that we had about austerity as an economic response, about the rise of Trump, why right-wing populism seems to be stronger than left-wing populism, etc., it all kind of like honed in around those points. And, you know, I just basically enjoyed coming on and enjoyed talking to him because it was the type of conversation that it's very hard to find in general, because it's open-ended and it's hopeful. And there is something that the left has always had a shortage of, it's hope. And with him gone, there's one less hope.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's going to be something that it's immensely difficult, both personally, but also politically, to lose his voice and perspective. And, you know, what we can try to do is to make sure that light and that work continues as best, you know, as possible, and that we can do our best to try to bring a little bit of Michael Brooks into our lives. But in that spirit, I mean, there's a lot to talk about today, and I'm really excited for this conversation. And, you know, just programmatically, I think we have 4 sections. We're going to do about 20 minutes on each of them. I'll keep you guys informed on the time, but I'm really hoping, basically for each section, I'll just kick to one of y'all to start us off. But if y'all are wanting to respond to one another, I think a conversation will be the best way to, you know, to format this discussion. But to start, I mean, there's no way around it. We have to talk about, you know, this pandemic that we're living through, and particularly what that's meant for working people. Because you know, there is certainly a lot of difficulty that we're all facing on the health side, but economically, people are suffering extremely right now. And I want to kick off by talking about this report that came out by Chuck Collins of the Institute for Policy Studies that found since March, billionaires' personal wealth in the United States has grown by $1 trillion as of November 24th. Mm-hmm. You know, which is an insane number. And then you consider what's happening for working people in this country. What's happening for working people in this country, not only have a lot of them seen their incomes be interrupted, you're also seeing this massive threat of evictions. And when it comes to the kind of programs that you would want a functioning government to provide for working people, we really haven't seen it. So, you know, the Federal Reserve and the U.S. government have been really effective, in my opinion, at looking out for the interests of the wealthy during this pandemic, while the response to the economic needs of working people has been, to put it lightly, inadequate. Do you all think that we can connect to the unequal pandemic response to how the U.S. government and the Federal Reserve respond to the 2008 crisis? And what would you like to see to sort of find a way to, you know, to deal with the needs that most people are facing? And I'd like to kick it to Mark if you'd like to start this conversation off.
Okay, can you give me 1 second till I turn the lights on in my office? They're
yeah, no problem.
And
I'll go
off, and I have to put them back on. Bloody annoying technology that's meant to make your life better. You know that one?
Yeah.
Like, literally, I'm standing here pushing this and it wouldn't even go on.
They're trying to sabotage us.
Oh, thank you. Good man. You know,
let there be light.
You know, my switches just on, off. No, I can't have that. Anyway. All right, let's get started. This is, okay, let's just start with this. This is called the K-shaped recovery, right? So basically, if you're an asset holder, you're in the top 20% or above, basically 2 things happen. The link to 2008 is quantitative easing. The Fed basically buys shed loads of bonds. It buys shed loads of bonds to support liquidity in financial markets. That basically puts a floor under prices indirectly, and they did even more of that, particularly in March when the Treasury bills market seized up. The second part of it is when you come out in April and say, we'll buy everything, we'll buy ETFs. They don't actually end up buying them, but basically it's kind of a Jedi mind trick, right? It's a bit like Draghi in 2012, you know, where he got it under control, so we have it under control. And effectively what that does is it says, I've just created a protected class of investments, and if you have them, don't worry, lads, I've got your back. Now, at that point in time, you've just told anyone who doesn't have rocks in their head, go buy those things. And if you go buy those things, they will go up in value. So that's the leg of the cake. Where is everybody else? Everybody else is on $1,200 checks. Now, why in a world where everybody is one of these are you sending people checks? And the answer is because you don't really want the money to go there. Right? That's the congressional politics of it. At the end of the day, bailing people out is difficult. Bailing corporations out, particularly when they've hollowed themselves out with buybacks, is actually quite easy. Now, the second thing is, and this is where I'm much more sympathetic to the Fed than Congress, the Fed's pipes for money run one way, right? They basically take the reserves and stick them in 25 banks, and then they're meant to go out to the rest of the economy. They have neither the capacity nor the political mandate to direct those pipes to Main Street. So the Main Street lending program that went through the Small Business Association, total disaster. Imagine putting a fire hose this big into a tap this big, right? That's basically what happened with this program. So you have a massive skew of not just attention and political will, literally the financial plumbing of the country goes this way through the banking system to Wall Street and out. It simply doesn't go this way. Now, the Fed, if you look at their own research, are completely aware of the inequality effects of quantitative easing, of what's happening to household income from the pandemic, the whole lot. And a great many of them think people that have been there, like Claudia Sam, people who are still there, like Brownard, who really want to do something more than this. But they're technocrats. That's not their job. That's not fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is held hostage by the Republican Party, and the Republican Party love deficits when they're in power so they can enrich their own constituents, and then punish Democrats for being 1 cent out Micawber-wise the minute they're in power, which is what we're seeing again. So in a sense, there's a link to 2008. It's quantitative easing. It was replicated again in this pandemic. There's a massive asymmetry to the protections afforded American corporations versus the American people. When you create a class of protected securities, you basically guarantee a stock market boom regardless of the real state of the real economy. And as usual, wage earners in the United States get stuffed because it's their fault they're unemployed. And that's what they get told. And even in this case, when it clearly isn't, that narrative is still there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Richard Wolff, how would you categorize, this response so far from both of these institutions, the Federal Reserve and the U.S. government, to the COVID crisis?
Well, I want to thank Mark. I don't have to go over all of that stuff again. Yeah, that. I noticed that Mary Daly, the Fed governor from San Francisco, gave a speech the other day in which she went pretty far compared to her fellow governors in admitting the inequality boosting dimension of everything that they've done, and pretty much admitting that they were in such a rush to prevent complete chaos that they just didn't care. It's exactly the way Mark described it, but they knew exactly what they were doing and what that would mean and where that would go. For her to say now, afterwards, gee, that was, okay, it's better than nothing. But that's really all you can say, given what they've done. So let me jump to a huge historical hypothesis, if I can. And I know I'm going out on a limb, but I'm among friends, so I can do it. I think this is such a massive breakdown and failure of capitalism that for the first time in my life, and I mean that, the decline and the disappearance are actually in my head, not as a wild fantasy, wishful thinking, but as something which, still a low probability, is not what it was. And let me explain. We have capitalist enterprises in this country that can produce masks and gloves and ventilators and hospitals. We can do all of that. We have the raw materials, we have the equipment, we have the labor power, we have everything. We didn't do it. It wasn't done. We still now, 9 months later, don't have adequate supplies of most of these crucial items. And I include tests and all the rest of it. So it seems to me a stark sentence is now utterable. The leaving things to the private capitalist sector, the profit motive, whatever you want to call it, does not produce that which we know we need to confront a known threat. Viruses have been with the human race from day one. We had a horrific one in 1918 that everybody who studies this stuff has to learn about, the so-called Spanish flu. Much more recently, we've had MERS, SARS, Ebola, and all the rest. There is no excuse. Everybody knows this can happen, and then you need these things to control infection. The private capitalist sector didn't do it. And they didn't do it for reasons that are baked into capitalism. It's too expensive. Who's going to make a mask, millions of them, store them and stockpile them in warehouses around the country, monitor them, secure them, clean them, replace them, and then for how long? Who knows, until the next virus comes. The risk, the reward, it all says to capitalists to do what they did, namely invest in something else, not make these things. So yeah. I can now say publicly, wherever I go, capitalism, the logic and how it works, and protecting the public health don't work together. They're
and if I could just like interject or to reinforce that, I think that everything you said about the masks and the PPE and ventilators and all that is absolutely true. But we can also talk about the vaccine. Like after MERS and SARS, which were both near misses for exactly what's happening right now. There could have been massive research put into to finding coronavirus vaccines. Both of those are coronaviruses, and this is not just Monday night quarterbacking. There are lots of papers you can read by scientists for years back warning we really need to research this stuff. Look at what almost happened in both of these cases. We really need to be looking into this, but the pharmaceutical companies don't have an incentive to do that. And I think it's really telling to compare the incentives the pharmaceutical companies have with a publicly run institution, obviously not an institution I'm a fan of, but, the imperialist U.S. military. But because it's publicly run, when they fund it, they can fund it in ways that have all kinds of unlikely scenarios in mind. Okay, what if there's a war here? What if this kind of thing happens? What if 2 wars break out in different parts of the world? And, we need to be ready for that. Whereas the pharmaceutical companies have to think about the next quarterly profit projection. So they think purely in terms of what are we going to sell next year, not what should we be doing to research, prepare for things that might be coming down the pipe in 5 years or 10 years.
Ben, the military is what I do. It's wonderful that you're thinking like this, and we really are on the same wavelength, because as soon as I finish explaining why private capitalism failed to deal with public health, no minor matter for it to have failed on, then I use the military as an example. I say to the people, well, of course, the government could have come in. The government could have come in and bought masks as fast as they came off the assembly line, and ventilators and hospital and all the rest of it. And then at government expense, stored them, stockpile them, monitor them, do all of that. And then I say, we know the government could have done it, because that's what the government does with the military. It's also unprofitable to make a missile and stick it in a warehouse waiting for the next war. It's too risky. And nobody would do it. They wouldn't build a tank or a missile or a jet plane or any of that crap. And so the government comes in and does exactly that. It buys it as fast as it comes off, pays a hefty price, guarantees the cost plus contract profit, and so you could have done for public health what you do, in fact, for the military, for the exact, except the 4 industries that dominate health in this country, doctors, hospitals, drug and device makers, and the insurers, they have a monopoly. I mean, they've worked out a deal to hold hostage this whole country, and the last thing they want is the government to come in, even if it would solve the problem, because it would lay open the Medicare for All option that is in the back of everyone's.
But behind that, there's another one, which is government doesn't think that way. And I'll give you the proof, right? So the proof is 2008. So the pandemic's totally different from 2008. No, they're not. They're both macroeconomic shocks. You know that you're going to get them. In 2008, we had the once-in-a-lifetime one, and we'd learned our lessons, and we'd de-risked the banks and all this sort of stuff. But we singularly didn't do a damn thing about economic preparedness for another major economic shock, right? There was zero learning. Even the austerity debacle in Europe, which defenestrated the whole of Southern Europe, the IMF learned internally from its documents, but in terms of its actual policy, maybe that much. What are we doing now? We're going to do exactly the same thing again, despite the fact that every country in the OECD can issue 15-year debt at negative real yield, which means the investor is paying you to take the bill and you pay back less 15 years from now than you do at present. You've got them starting again. Oh, we have to tighten our belts. Look at that pile of debt. The national credit card is maxed out and all the rest of the horseshit that they come out periodically. So it's not only that they don't learn or don't think that way, they're incentivized to keep this whole shenanigans going on as well. And at the end of the day, what does it lead to? It leads in fragility in health, fragility in the economy, and fragility in people's lives. And how do people respond to that fragility? They get stressed, and they get pissed, and they get angry. And that's what's driving our politics. It's all linked.
That's right. Absolutely. Here's my other big thought, and then I'll stop. The 13th century, 14th and 13th, 14th century, we had the Black Death. We had this situation in which a certain level of exhaustion under feudalism, soil exhaustion and so forth, combined to weaken a population, make them vulnerable. They had the Black Death, the rats, the lice, and all the rest. And a third of Europe, if my numbers are correct, is dies. And I don't think feudalism ever recovered. I mean, you can pretty quickly see whether it's the Renaissance or the Reformation or all of the rest, it's downhill. They could not recover, and rightly so. A system so deficient that it would do that or allow or enable that is a system that consciously or unconsciously is going to be rejected by people in a way and with a self-confidence that they may not have had before being forced to go through such a catastrophe. I'm wondering, and of course we will all be long dead, but I'm wondering if we could hypothetically imagine looking back a century or so from now at this moment and saying to ourselves, this level, particularly in the United States, which as the leading capitalist country is quite the place for this to happen, that if it happens in the richest or one of the richest countries, they have to lose 500,000 people, which is what I understand the prediction now is minimum. Lose 500,000 people, have 50 million sick with this thing, suffer the economic catastrophe. You know, I know that half the people in school in this country are not getting an education because of all the fake distance learning crap that I'm unfortunately participating in, but I have no illusions about. The cost to this society is going to be massive beyond what it already is, and it'll stand as an irrefutable critique of what this system failed to avoid.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, like a metaphor that I think about sometimes, you know, because of course, you know, you can say, look, capitalism, you know, didn't cause the virus. Okay, sure. But, you know, if you have a sweatshop where there's like flammable material left out all over the place and the doors are locked, you know, from the outside so workers can't leave during their shifts, and there's a lightning strike, and then, you know, because of the conditions, there's a fire that spreads throughout the entire place and everybody dies. Yeah, the factory owners didn't start didn't cause the lightning strike, but it's still their fault what happened. And, you know, a metaphor that I've heard bandied about, or I heard, I think in the spring, you know, started to be bandied about, kind of along the lines of Professor Wolff's point about the Black Death and feudalism, is people saying, you know, this is like the Chernobyl of American capitalism, which the first time you hear it, it sounds like, oh, that's hyperbolic. But you think, no, it's not. It's the opposite, because the death toll from Chernobyl wasn't even a drop in the bucket compared to the death toll of COVID. It was like a fraction of a drop. So yeah, I mean, it's a huge like indictment of the system that it's played out in this way.
And also, so we have about 5 minutes left before we move on to the next one. I also just wanted to get your thoughts on this too, Ben, because I know you got in trouble for, writing some pieces about, the reopen protests. But, in my opinion, if you don't provide people money, if you don't provide them support, and you tell especially low-wage workers that they have to stay home, you set yourself up for it. Now, being fair, a lot of the people who are running those kind of protests aren't, working people necessarily, those like, business owners and folks like that. But there is a large contingent of Americans who they don't see any real option. They're not choosing to ignore the virus. There are a lot of people who are saying, I don't have a choice because I have to go into work or else I won't be able to provide for myself.
Yeah, no, that's right. So the context of this was pretty early on in the pandemic, like late spring, early summer. It all blurs together. In my home state of Michigan, there were these protests at the state capitol by people who were opposed to the COVID lockdowns, and of course, the people who were running the show were horrifying right wingers. There were like Proud Boys who were blocking. Like, there's a picture of a doctor in a white coat going out to plead with one of the leaders to stop blocking the intersection in front of Sparrow Hospital. Stopping people from getting in and out, which is the hospital where both of my siblings were born. So obviously, I can't stand these people. But the point I was making in that article for Jacobin, the left can't simply dismiss the anti-lockdown protests, is not that these weren't horrible right-wing ghouls. They obviously were, and it's not that I share their goals. Of course, I don't. I think we absolutely do need lockdowns. My position since the pandemic started, and still now, is that we should shut down everything that can reasonably be shut down, and send everybody a couple $1,000s a month, until it's all over. That just seems obvious. But the problem is, what I was pointing out in the article, is that we. Back then, now it's considerably eased up, even though the pandemic's actually getting worse. But at that point, we were doing the first half of that program, but we weren't doing the second half. We weren't providing people with meaningful economic support. And so the worry that I raised in the article, and I quoted people, I said, even people who are members of, thuggish right-wing organizations seem to be partially motivated by these kinds of concerns, making, like rent payments, making, car payments, all of these things that they can't do if they can't go to work and earn a living, and, a couple of $1,200 checks is not going to get it done. And so the worry, Twitter being what it is, a lot of people reacted to the headline without reading it, or, quote mined it. Not just random Twitter trolls like Matt Iglesias, reacted to it this way. But the point of the article was, if we want this to stay marginal, right, which at that time it was, if we want this to stay marginal, that we don't want this movement against these necessary public health lockdowns to gain support, we need to start providing people with meaningful economic assistance so they can afford to stay home. And that's really what our eye should be on in all of this.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think that segues quite well into the the second bit, and I'll kick to you, Wolff, to start this off. But so much of the conversation about Trump, rightfully, is his horrific behavior and racism. But now, as we're looking at the end of the Trump administration, I'd be curious what you think the long-term effects of what you would call the Trump economic policy, because I hear two different stories on this. A lot of people make the argument that most of his economic policies are going to be easily reversed, but I'd be curious if you think that's the case, and just sort of a general sense of what these past 4 years have been like.
Well, I'm not so sure how easily they can be reversed. And maybe I should say it differently. I'm not so clear that the Democrats want to reverse all that much. And let me give you some of the starkest examples. I think it's remarkable that Mr. Biden Mark seems to have had technological...
All I do is I can move and it comes on. You move sometimes, it doesn't come on. I want to switch. I want 1920s technology. All right, carry on.
And you're in a rich university. That's
why. This is it. This is why technology is bullshit. I hope that we get onto this.
Yes.
Yeah, we're going to get to it soon.
Look, for example, at the careful way that the Biden administration is not dissociating itself from the anti-China drumbeat of the Trump administration. Come on, this was an obvious moment. If you didn't want this deteriorating relationship to get worse between what are arguably the ascending and the descending power, and that's a very dangerous combination, history teaches us. You would want to say something, do something. They're not. And I find that frightening, and I find that significant. Here's another example. We thought, or some of us thought, that the turn away, the nationalism, the economic nationalism that Steve Bannon articulated and Trump, clumsily repeated. I mean, not to say that Bannon's was all that sophisticated either, but at least there was something there. It's not clear to me that the Democrats, look, the whole world, let me put it different. The whole world is wondering. I have a lot of contacts in Europe, so I'm not talking about much else. But in Western Europe, where I have contact, the whole world there, the political world, and so I'm wondering how far into the corporate culture in this country the nationalist turn is accepted, that we are disconnecting, that we are uncoordinating, whatever the hell the words are, we're finished with a global, I don't want to go overboard here, we're not going to undo this stuff, but that the globalization surge is now going to be transformed into a more nationalist, beggar my neighbor repetition syndrome, let's call it, and that the Democrats are not going to undo a good bit of that. Yeah, we'll be nicer to our allies, maybe, at least for a while, but the allies are far from sure.
Yeah.
I can assure you, I really can, that in the highest levels of French, German, Spanish, Italian capitalism, there is an ongoing debate about whether their future is closer with China than it is with the United States. And they're not going to undo that conversation very quickly unless they see a lot more clarity from the Biden administration than anything that has come from them so far to dissuade them. They're covering their own bets, and they're not sure that the descending the United States is not going to be the kind of partner that drags you underwater and drowns you along with them. They don't want to be taken down with the United States. They're a big unit. You put all the EU together, they're as big as the United States, bigger in fact, and they know that, and the Chinese know that, and the Japanese know that, and the Australian. I mean, things are moving that I think will make it possible that we will look back on the Trump administration. We will forget all the clumsy grotesquerie, but we will see some shifts in economics that really weren't his doing, that he was enacting processes that will continue.
I think that's absolutely right. Here's a couple of ways to think about it. In what seemed to be at the time a typically Trumpian move, the US ambassador to the OECD about 6 months ago withdrew the United States from cooperation over a minimum global corporation tax. They just said, we're done, we're out. And the Europeans, as usual, went, oh, it's so terrible, we're trying to do so hard, the French have got the tax, etc. Well, what the Americans figured out was pretty much all those taxes would be paid by half a dozen American firms that constitute 25% of the global stock indices. It's the FANGs plus Tesla and the associated firms. The Europeans have no digital platforms at scale. They talk in terms that make absolutely no sense about a digital Mittelstand, which basically tells you literally don't understand anything about the sector at all. And increasingly, if you look at the dispersal of profits across the world, what you find is a very small number of very big firms that don't employ too many people earn most of the profits. Their key suppliers still employ a lot of people and they make decent profits. And everybody else is in the long tail of you're getting nothing, right? Now, if you're the United States, intellectual property rights, monopoly position, not paying taxes are integral parts of your business model. That's what's there. Is it any other Democratic or any other Republican administration going to come in and change that? Absolutely not, because it benefits us. That's exactly where that is. To me, the other thing about this is very interesting. You want to bring Trump up, we have to deal with this. Why did his vote share go up? Why did he make inroads into people he calls rapists and murderers? Why do working class women like that patriarchy and that offense? Right? I think we need to think long and hard about this. And one of the parts of the story is the following. The Democrats have zero credibility amongst the American working class because they have witnessed nothing but relative decline under their watch. Right? Let's take that as the baseline. Now, there's lots of things going on. There's the struggle for 15. There's better organization. There's a whole bunch of things that have gone on in this. But there's also the little Twitter fight that happened in 2018 between Trump and the Fed, where he basically was bemoaning the fact that they were trying to even thinking about raising rates. And of course, the intelligent community of which I am a part and we are a part was like, oh, that Trump, he's terrible. He doesn't understand independent central banks. He's underestimating the risk of inflation. Bullshit, right? So basically what happened was the Republicans said, we're going to do a game of chicken with the Fed. We're going to do our massive tax cuts for our top constituents, but we're also going to spend a ton of money. We're going to run the economy really, really hot, and we dare you to raise interest rates, because if you do, it's going to be on you, and we're going to totally blame you for it. What happened? In 2017, 2018, and 2019, wages for the bottom 20th percentile and 40th percentile of the US labor market went up 3 years in a row for the first time in years. They actually experienced material improvement. Now, there were many factors going into that, but that's part of why that message, that resonance, that Trump phenomena gained votes. The Democrats went into this as a referendum on COVID and decency. They nearly lost the election. They won it by slivers in half a dozen states. Let's not overestimate this. Trumpism is alive and well domestically, and the structural stuff that we've talked about internationally is there too. This is not changing anytime soon.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely. I think it's definitely there. It will be interesting though to see, and I'd be curious if your thoughts on this, Ben. How well you think because so many of Trump's economic policies really are, GOP playbook with, a fairly, whatever, he used gross, but, effective messenger, like he was able to, he knows how to use the media and things like that. How well do you think, Trumpism will be able to last without him sort of at the head of the movement, without him being in government, Ben?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends what you mean by Trumpism. I think that the particular rhetorical appeal that Trump had, I could actually see Republicans having a lot of trouble recapturing. And that is, it is part of the reason, right? Like, I think that, it's good to have a materialist analysis of these things, but also that, some of this was about his particular rhetorical pitch and the cultural war politics of that. I mean, like, that is some of the reason why, the election, was close as it was, and why so many people who don't normally vote came out, and voted for him this time. And I could see saying that, like, if you have some like second drawer Trump, right, some Josh Hawley type, trying to fill that role in the future, that like that might just not work as well, rhetorically. I mean, once you've had that good uncut Colombian, Trump, then like this sort of this stuff that's all mixed up with baby powder, like Josh Hawley or whoever, some regular, Republican politician who's trying to play Trump.
I do not want the idea of got politicians anywhere near my nose. Stop this right now.
Yeah, fair enough. But as you point out, and this is a really important point, that despite that economic nationalist rhetoric that Professor Wolff was talking about earlier, which honestly, even in Bannon's case, I think is very often it's more a matter of rebranding often than it is a matter of substantive policy differences. Like, I remember thinking, like, after hearing all this stuff, they're this different kind of right-wing, economic populism. And then you actually start looking at the details. And even if Bannon had gotten what he wanted in the Trump administration, which he didn't, what that would have meant was raising the top marginal tax rate back to like closer to what it was in the Clinton era. Right. and spending a little bit of it on infrastructure, it was nothing. And certainly, something actually I remember Michael pointing out after after Bannon went on the Red Scare podcast, and lots of people were mad at them, because they were platforming this monster. But he said no, he liked it because they were asking him a question that nobody normally asks him, which is, "You're such a populist. Why don't you support Medicare for all?" And he just doesn't have a good answer to that. Again, a lot of it's just regular republicanism with better. It's just Reaganite republicanism with better branding. Like when Bannon says deconstruct the administrative state, that sounds very edgy and a little scary, and also oddly a little bit like something Foucault would say. But what does he actually mean by it that's not just deregulation? Right. And certainly, and that's Bannon. Trump, I think that, I think some of the policies that Professor Wolff identified, especially the trade war with China, were somewhat new. Right, there were continuations of things that happened before. There were continuation to some extent, there were break to some extent, and I share his pessimism that that Biden and the Democrats, will really reverse course dramatically on that. But certainly domestically, what did Trump do? Other than mismanage the COVID crisis quite as badly as he did, maybe, but but economically, what did Trump do that Mitt Romney wouldn't have done? It's not clear to me. I mean, he did, he was all about the tax cuts. He certainly, he stuffed the National Labor Relations Board with hardcore union busters. He made very little effort to do anything meaningful to fulfill all the lies that he told in places like Youngstown about how he was going to bring the jobs back, or West Virginia, with the coal mines, the coal industry. As of right now, is actually employing fewer people than it did when Trump took office. So I think that just to try to connect the two strands here, right, the rhetorical and the substantive, my hope is that when Trump leaves, and if he doesn't, come back like, Teddy Roosevelt to, run again later, in a few years, that, when it is somebody who's much less convincing in that sort of role, than Trump is, then some of those voters might start to see, oh, wait, there was no there. Like you said, jobs, make America great, economic nationalism. But then what do you actually do other than to line the pockets of your friends? And I hope more people will notice that. But my fear is that they won't have any reason to, if the Democrats keep on nominating people like Biden and Harris, who can't make that kind of strong contrast.
If I could add just something, let me talk a little bit about West Virginia, because you brought it up, and it's a good example. West Virginia used to be, until around the year 2000, a 100% solid Democratic state, very pro-union, very much involved with the miners' union in the coal fields and so on, and just delivered for the Democratic Party over and over again. But in both 2016 and 2020, went overwhelmingly for Trump. Solid Republican Trump. Currently, they are, I believe, the number one state in the United States for what is now euphemistically called food insecurity. We used to call it hunger.
Poverty, yeah.
And anyway, 1 out of 7, I just did some work on it. 1 out of 7 citizens of West Virginia is now receiving distributions of free food based on demonstrating that their families don't have enough to eat on a regular basis. That's 1 in 7 of the people, roughly 250,000 out of roughly 1.8 million as the population of that state. Okay, why? Well, it's a little bit what Mark said before. It is a disgust with the Democratic Party for having not only not built on the tradition or history of the Great Depression, which is when they all went Democratic because of Roosevelt and all of that. They're disgusted. The Democrats, presided over the collapse of the coal industry, that presided over the collapse of West Virginia as a place. Nothing was substituted, no solutions were found, and they became a place of, opioid self-destruction.
Of despair, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Unspeakable economic catastrophe, right? And they're angry at the Democrats, and they're giving the Democrats the middle finger. They're voting Republican. I don't believe, I really do. I think it's an insult of those people to say of them they're not voting their economic interest. That's not true. They are. Now, they're doing it in an impetuous way. But what would you expect? They've been literally screwed for decades. They're going to give you the fingers, about all they can do. And they're going to vote for that orange clown. They know that their chances of getting anywhere with the Republican Party, which, by the way, in that state is owned and operated by the coal company executives, they know they're not. Well, they're not stupid. They really aren't stupid people. They know. They don't think politicians are going to do anything for them. So they might as well vote for the Republican who at least says some bullshit.
It's a politics of recognition. He recognizes them in a way that the Democrats don't. Yeah, totally.
To me, it's a little bit like watching the British working class vote for Brexit. Well, what the hell is that got to do?
No, absolutely. It's not the EU's problem. Here's a slightly different cast on the same thing. If you look at the electoral map, start in Alaska, go to the Dakotas, go through Oklahoma, get to East Texas, turn left, go right along the coast of Louisiana, come up, go up and end in West Virginia. You have the heartland of the Republicans. What is it that all of those states do? They refine, extract, move, and play with carbon and carbon assets. They are also the home of steel, coal, and other declining sectors. Now look at where the Democrats won. They need lots of power on the coast, but they'd like it to be electric and they'd like it to come from solar or renewable. In other words, there is now a disconnect of fate between the economic models of these two parts of the country. And those people in West Virginia aren't just angry and giving the finger. They know that basically the Green New Deal is a notion that coal miners become coders. And they know bullshit when they see it because they know that that's not going to happen. So essentially, the Democrats' economic model, given the way that it is pronounced and is articulated as the just transition, and we care about inclusion, etc., just sounds that we don't factor into this. We are not part of this. You don't give a shit about us. This is more proof of that fact, right? And we're as well throwing our lot in with the coal executives because at least we'll have jobs.
Yeah, and I think that, like, to be fair, the Green New Deal, which is, of course, is not the platform of the leadership of the Democratic Party. Remember, Nancy Pelosi called it the green, the Green Dream or whatever was her phrase. But I think that one problem about the Green New Deal is, as stated, it's great. But I think to tie into something that Mark just said, I think because of people's recent experience, because that was like what you said, Mark, is exactly what the Obama administration policy was. It was, we'll open up some, technology training centers in Appalachia, which is basically a elaborate way of saying stop complaining and just learn how to code. And so when they're told, some Democrats want to do really extreme environmental stuff, unfortunately, what a lot of people hear is, so you're going to just do like more of the same. It's going to be a more extreme version, that they take seriously the idea that the coal jobs will go away because they have been going away. So why, of course, they'll take that seriously. But they don't take seriously, and this connects with what Richard was saying about the people voting, allegedly voting against their economic interests. They don't take seriously the idea that any of the stuff that's supposed to be done for them is going to happen because they have learned to believe that you can't actually impact people's lives with politics in that way. That whatever politicians might say, you're not actually going to have programs, to make their lives better if they win.
Think about the Democrat strategy, the electoral strategy of this election is just passed, right? Essentially, there's a thing in the middle called 80 million working class people. And they drew a box around it that went urban, suburban, middle class, technology, public sector worker, university graduate, everything except what was in that box. There was no attempt. You look at who the Democrats have advisors, where they draw their elites from, where they draw their campaigners from. It's basically the Ivy League plus. Given the collapse of the union movement, they have absolutely no organic connections to these communities in any way at all. When you think about the excitement around the Trump rally, right, it's a community event for a community that feels completely ignored. What do the Democrats have? They've got nothing like this.
Totally, and this is to Richard's point, right? That because people know that if all you're talking about is training, well, look, I mean, there's a world difference between being trained to do a job and actually being offered a job at the end of the process, doing it, and so that's just a nothing. Trump's saying that he'll bring the jobs back. It's bullshit, but like, at least he's doing people the favor of offering them some bullshit that pretends to address their concern. And really, I think that Green New Deal, I think that's pretty good framing, but I think we really need to go into the teeth of what the gap is there and say, like, green jobs for all, be very explicit about this, that you're not just going to do something to hope that a job materializes in the future, that no, the government is going to give you a job right now.
I want to make sure that we have enough time for this last section. So I think I'll reserve this last bit and just drop the fourth one. But before we get to that, I also just want to mention on the Green New Deal, check out Ryan Pollock's work, who I've had on TMBS. He wrote a great piece in Jacobin. He's a union organizer in Texas who was able to get them to pass a Green New Deal style resolution through the AFL-CIO. And you have to understand, in Texas, that means people who are working, either directly or indirectly with oil and gas. And the way that they were able to do that was to drop, any acknowledgement of, to AOC, even dropping the Green New Deal as like something, as like a slogan, but rather federal economic policy. But what won people over was what Ben was just talking about, paying people, their salaries to allow them to transition and to allow the union to take leadership roles in the industry. And that worked successfully. But this last bit, I'm really excited for this because I think it really does tie into, the kind of pop understanding of what's going on in the economy and why people are really struggling to, achieve the kind of prototypical American dream. You get a job, you're able to provide for yourselves. Is this narrative about technology, right? And that we have reached such a, our technology is so advanced now that, that means that wages necessarily have to go down. And one person who, he didn't do super well in the primary, but really invigorated a lot of people, was Andrew Yang, talking about the UBI, universal basic income, as a solution to that, basically evacuating the labor struggle or the fight for fair wages or all these other things, and just saying that we just need to, support people directly because there is no possibility of having a functional, economy that can provide for people anymore because of technology. So I obviously betray some of my feelings about that idea, but I'd like to talk about, technology and unemployment in this last section. And I'll kick to you, Ben, to talk about this because I know we've done a lot on, Yang's and also this kind of idea that technology itself is what is driving unemployment.
Yeah. So
underemployment.
Right. So, as far as the last part of the question, the extent to which technological changes, as opposed to other factors, are actually driving, is actually driving unemployment, and the extent to which that'll be long term, I will defer to the actual economists here. But I think there are some big picture things that are worth saying about this. That one has to do with the limits of that kind of like Yang program, which I think you're right, some people were really responding to because he seemed to be taking the problem seriously. That you have all this unemployment and you need some sort of direct government assistance to do something about it. That alone struck people as it goes back to what Richard Wolff was saying about West Virginia, recognition, just that recognition meant something. And I think it also goes to the point about that sort of learned skepticism about what government's actually going to do, that, a lot of more radical structural changes, unfortunately, sound very unrealistic to lots of people right now. Okay, could you get a check? All right, you could imagine that, right? You could imagine getting a check. But I think that once you actually start to think about what that would look like, it's just grotesquely inadequate, especially if it's the a la carte UBI, which I think realistically, if it happened, unfortunately, I think is what we get, rather than a UBI that some leftists have advocated as part of a suite of programs that would address various other needs in various other ways. But if you just got it, it would actually likely be used as an excuse to cut other kinds of government assistance. Look, we're already giving people a check. Why do we also need to provide them with X, Y, or Z? Mm-hmm. Two, it would immediately be eaten up, right? I mean, look, if you're a landlord and you know that all of your tenants are getting an extra $1,000 in the mail now, then why wouldn't you just raise the rent? What's going to stop you from doing that? Now, there are things that we could do to stop people from doing that, but at that point, you're talking about a much more ambitious program than just cutting people a check. And just on a really big picture point, I think that whether it's true or not, and certainly I think there are, again, I'm sure Richard and Mark will speak more to this part. I do believe there are reasons to be skeptical about this, if nothing else, from the fact that we've heard it so many times before. You can find lots of stuff in the 80s, the 70s, people saying the robots are coming for all the jobs. Now, maybe there'll come a point when it's true, right? Just because something hasn't come true a number of times in the past doesn't necessarily mean that it never will. But I think that maybe the last point I'd make about this would just be that, look, let's say for the sake of argument that this time it will. That this time it really is true that developing technology will lead to long-term mass unemployment in a way that it hasn't before. Well, if that's true, just sending people yang bucks every month is a grotesquely inadequate solution to that problem, and one that could really start looking like the bread rations in the late Roman Republic. When you had all these people who used to be small farmers, who had been bought up by big landed estates, ended up as paupers in Rome, and so you start instituting the daily bread ration so they have enough to eat that they don't starve to death, or riot. And undermine the power structure in Rome. That's really what that's the sort of grim cyberpunk dystopia vision that the Yang UBI program really sounds like to me. And look, if it is true, right? If it were, for the sake of argument, true that we really are going to get the long-term mass technological unemployment this time, that actually gives us much more of a reason. Just go full commie on this. That gives us much more of a reason to care who controls the means of production, because if it is a small class of capitalists who own the machines and the machines are doing all of the work, then that's very bad news for the rest of us. Our best case scenario is some equivalent to that Roman bread ration. If, on the other hand, the machines are collectively owned, democratically owned, then if the machines are doing most of the work, that's fantastic, because we can just spread around what remaining work still needs to be done by humans, so nobody has to work very much, and everybody can have the same standard of living. So sometimes people present this as if, this sort of like old-fashioned 19th century socialist question about ownership of the means of production is irrelevant because of these technological changes, or supposedly this coming mass technological unemployment. I'd say that if the prediction was actually true this time, that would actually make those questions much more urgent.
If I could comment, I would like to play the economist card here for a moment. I think
that'll save me doing it.
Yeah, no. We'll make a duet out of it. I think we need to separate the question of employment from the question of technology. The attempt to link those as if they have a necessary one-to-one correspondence is a terrible collapse in the face of neoclassical economics and things like that we shouldn't and do not need to do. Let me illustrate it with a simple arithmetic. Suppose we're producing something and we spend $100 on workers and $100 on materials and we produce some shit and we sell it for whatever, 300. Okay, and now a machine comes along that is twice as productive as before. So as we use up the existing machines and we replace them with the new ones, everybody is twice as productive as they were before. So what now happens, we know with capitalism, what is going to happen is that, there go Mark Spikes.
Keep going.
With capitalism, the employer has a clear incentive. He's going to fire half the workers, right, because the other half are now twice as productive. Let's keep this example simple. They will now produce the total output before, but with half the labor force. He will sell it as before, earn the same revenue, assume a constant price. There's no reason here not to. And basically, he profits he gains in profit the one half of his payroll that he doesn't have to pay to those workers anymore. So it's great for him. He fires the workers. Everything else is the same. And by the way, this is a wonderful incentive for technical progress that the capitalist gains from, right? But now let's look at an alternative scenario. He says to the workers, or the workers say to him, okay, we're now twice as productive as before. We want everything to stay exactly as it was. You pay us what you paid us before. You buy the new machines, just like you did before, same cost, because it's the same price of the machine, it's just twice as effective. You'll produce the same amount, you'll sell it, everything will be the same. But we will all work 4 hours a day, not 8. The profit is the same. The revenue is the same. The benefit of the technology has accrued as leisure to the workers rather than profit to the capitalist. Hello? That's what we're interested in. We're not Luddites. We want the technical change because we could benefit. But what blocks us is capitalism and the way it works, which puts the decision of how to utilize the technology in the hands of a person who's going to do it in manner A and impose that on the workers rather than having the majority decide to use the technology for the benefit of the majority in the form of a transformation of their life, half the hours of labor, same wage as before.
Yeah.
I mean, I've done the work. I can assure you the arithmetic is foolproof. There's no problem. But it's a wonderful illustration that you could have massive technological change that would make the life of the mass of people better if it was used in a particular way and was not held hostage to the profit criterion, which is now why it's a terrible fear that AI or robotics will destroy our jobs rather than make our lives better. That's a very old socialist argument, but it holds water brilliantly.
I totally agree. I'll take it in a slightly different direction. I want to put the issue of UBI to one side. I think it's a very complex issue. And just look at the technology unemployment one. Plug for a book. If you want to make that case, this is the smartest case, right? This is the one. That's a really good thing. And the basic story here is it's not technology, and it's dead easy to understand why, because if technology was doing this, technology measured as productivity would be going up. It's falling. But what's happening is output, because of global overcapacity, is falling even faster. So it looks like productivity is increasing and that's causing unemployment. It's actually not. It's the fact that you have so much overcapacity globally in manufacturing, and everybody's been shedding it since the 1970s, that basically the game is over in terms of that being a growth engine and we don't have a new one to pick it up. So if you want to link it, that's the way to link it. I'm almost convinced by that, but I've always had a problem with overcapacity arguments in the sense that they're intensely structural. They take things that's really a flow as a kind of a stock. And here's what I mean by that. If the problem is you've got too much capacity, increase demand. Right? Technically, there's no reason you can't do that. So you can imagine a world in which, and this was very much the key to the kind of the Fordist post-war economic model, if you basically increase your capital stock with a constant share of labor productivity, as those workers get more productive, if they're able to claim their share of productivity, you're going to increase consumption. That increase in consumption means more final demand, which basically absorbs the extra production, right? So in principle, there is a solution to this. The second thing is, it's a bit of a lump of labor, right? There's only a certain amount of work to be done. And once we've done it, there's no work left. Now, when you immediately think like, that's nonsense, right? Now, look, we were talking earlier about, decarbonization, Green New Deal, whatever you want to call it, right? Just think about the following. 30% of US carbon emissions come from the fact that we build the shittiest buildings in the OECD, right? Your windows are not quite as bad as the English, which are painted shut, single pane, but they're getting there, right? Drywall, 2x4s, the whole lot, terrible insulation, whole lot. So you're going to have to refit every building in a country of 330 million people to get that down. That's a 30-year project involving work and lots of it. So the notion that there's no work and it's all going to be done by robots, right? It's just garbage. My final example of this, right, is around 2010 when all this started with the whole sort of race against the machine and all these books coming out and the Oxford report, and we're all going to be replaced, right? It's happening right in the middle of a financial crisis with mass unemployment. I mean, talk about taking the finger to people. I mean, the Financial Times was brilliant to read at that point because it was almost like, all you people that just blew up the world, here's a great investment opportunity for you now. You've been bailed out. Let's really go screw everyone, right? And that's what it sounded like. But the thing was, it was just people hawking bits of the sky to each other. Today, Uber sold its self-driving car division at a loss because it doesn't work. I could have told them that 10 years ago. It's ridiculous, right? The other one was so many people in the United States bought this argument about technology, particularly in trucking, was going to do in trucking, that by 2014, I think it was, the whole industry was short 120,000 drivers. And wages were rising faster in trucking than anywhere because you couldn't get people who had the licenses because nobody invested in them because they were all going to be replaced by robots. Self-fulfilling horseshit, right? So, I'm deeply skeptical of the technology stuff. If there is a link, it's that. And I think that one is not as hard and fast as is often made out.
Yeah, maybe when we refit all the buildings, for the green technology, we can also put back in light switches.
Yes, definitely. That's a big fun.
Really, it becomes crazy. Mark is absolutely right. We are a disaster as a society in terms of providing a decent retirement for people who have done their life's work.
Right.
There is a vast set of programs that need staffing that can't be done by robots to help provide a reasonable life for a fast-growing segment of our population, the older folk. We don't have anything like the quality daycare that masses of young people with children. I mean, there is no end to what we could do. There is no unemployment problem, except that our rule is nobody gets a job unless it's profitable for someone else to do that.
Yeah.
It's crazy, an arrangement like that. It always was crazy. And that's part of the old socialism that we have to rediscover, rewrite it a little bit for the modern idiom. But it's right there, and much of that work has been done.
Well, I think, so we don't go too long, I think that might actually be a perfect place to settle things up. I wish we could, continue talking for a bunch longer.
Well, luckily you have a show and you can have us all back on.
I would love to do that sometime soon. I know we didn't even get into, honestly, like Prop 22 and the fact that, that's what Uber's worried about, by the way. The self-driving cars are one thing, but being able to redefine labor laws, there's a reason that they're very fixated on that. So maybe that's a teaser for another conversation down the line. But thank you so much, Mark, Richard, and Ben, for being here for this great conversation, and also, spending a little bit of time remembering our, our good friend Michael Brooks.
Thanks, David.
It's a pleasure. He was a great fellow. He brought us together. He spoke to a generation of people that needed and wanted what he was producing. And when he started, it wasn't available. And he's a major provider of that. And we will all be, in complex ways, in his debt for years to come.
I'm cool.
No question.
Said. Well, thank you all.
Thank you.